Perry Mason takes on a case that is 25 years old, Chapter 7. Finally, Monday came, and it was time for Fred and his wife to head over to the city. They lived about 45 miles away and decided to drive there. They could have taken the bus or the train, but they were not sure of the schedule, and perhaps they would like to take on a baseball game that afternoon if everything went well. As they pulled into the tall, well-mannered building that held both the Paul Drake Detective Agency and the office of the world-famous Perry Mason, attorney at law, Fred took a deep breath. He was indeed very nervous, but hopefully he would find out the truth soon. As they went up the elevator, Jane thought of what they had gone through for the past years. It had always been a space between them, and most of it had been caused by the death of Ralph Walden. He had never trusted her with everything, and she had endured the gossip that had endured for years. There had been the stress of some also knowing that she had information that she wasn't being forthright with. It seemed that everywhere she went, people thought that perhaps Fred had been a murderer. The office was large and well designed. It was designed to be both comfortable and businesslike. Everything could be run efficiently, and Jane was sure that Perry Mason's wife, Della, had had her hand in how the office had been designed. They were met by Della, who had a small office on the side of the suite. She came out of the office as soon as the desk lady rang her. Della was a neatly dressed, good-looking woman who appeared to be in her 40s. She smiled at them and opened the door to a much larger office. There, sitting at the desk, was a large man with big blue eyes, dark hair, and a very loud presence. It was Perry Mason. He stood up and shook both their hands, and he waited for them to take a seat and for Della to take her seat next to him. Perry had started the conversation off by saying, "I've spent some time looking into the case. It is very old and cold. So what has brought you here to me so many years later? Also, I have a man named Paul Drake who will be assisting me in the investigation. Is it all right if he comes into the office now and listens to the conversation? All conversations are confidential," and he assured them. Fred was relieved to hear that Paul Drake was willing to take the case. The agency was known for its ability to solve many crimes, and it was said that they were the best in the business. He agreed, and Della immediately rang the Drake office. Shortly after Della placed the call, there was a tap on the door, and she opened the door, and in walked a very young man. He was tall, with blonde, curly hair, and smiled as he shook the hands. He was introduced as Paul Drake, and so the investigation began. As Fred explained to the group that he was never sure if Ralph had hit his head during the fight that he and Ralph had had the night before, Paul took down notes, as did Della. Perry Mason just seemed to be taking everything in. He was listening intently to the man and would retain it very well. This is something that Perry Mason was famous for. He would remember things as they were told to him, word for word, when it was important, especially in the courtroom. Perry Mason leaned back in his chair and told Fred and his wife that he would look into the murder, and along with his friend Paul Drake and his agency, would do their best to find out what happened so long ago. Are you sure that there's nothing else from the time of the fight? That is when Fred remembered the shirt. He kept it hidden away so long. Perhaps with the new technology, they could get some evidence from it. Fred told Perry about the shirt, and he was told that it was important to bring the shirt to the office immediately. Better yet, Paul said that he would pick it up from him in the morning. Jane was surprised about the shirt. She remembered finding the shirt in a bag in the trash the day after Ralph had disappeared. She had assumed that her husband had gotten rid of it years ago. This must have been bothering him far worse than she had ever thought. Back in town, Marcus and Tom were busy piling up more information on what had happened the night before Ralph Walden had died. The next step was to talk to the bank, but this was not as easy as it once been. Banks were not the single banks that they had been before. They were large corporations with records that were 20 years old and going to have to go to court if they were going to go and get their information. It would take lots of digging. As the two officers approached the courthouse, they knew that they were going to be in there for hours. But after 2 hours, they got a subpoena in hand. Now they needed to go to the bank and see what they had in their records. The bank loan officers are very cooperative, but all the information had been sent out to a central office years ago. And if they wanted to get to the information quickly, they would need to go to the central bank located just 20 miles from town. Without hesitation, the two officers thanked the man from the bank and headed to the main office. Word was starting to get around town that the case had been reopened. You can't keep a secret for very long in a small town, and gossip was starting to be common and in and around the other stores in town. Paul Drake was now in the investigation of a murder mode. He was going to handle this case himself. He knew that he was young and some of the workers thought of him as just a kid, but he wanted to make a good mark on his record. He was going to make it his job, no matter what, to bring the murder of Ralph Walden to justice. As Paul arrived at the small town, he took note of the largest business in the area. That appeared to be the business where Fred worked. There were no hotels in the town, so he would have to stay in a small motor lodge just outside of town. Did have internet, and perhaps he wouldn't be noticed if he was in that part of town. But a young, good-looking man driving an expensive convertible stuck out like a sore thumb, and soon everyone in town was talking about him. It wasn't long before it was common knowledge that he was Paul Drake, and he was here to investigate the murder of Ralph Walden. End of chapter 7.